Okay, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Buenas tardes. My name is Diego Alburez, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel on this emerging area of demographic research that uses sort of unconventional data and approaches to answer demographic questions. And I'm a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Germany. And before getting started and before introducing the panel, I would just like to thank the organization of the Congress for allowing us to organize this session. And of course, the panelists for being here and sharing their expertise with us. So we have chosen to have this session in English, but there is simultaneous translation available. So if you would like to use that, I would recommend that you go to the bottom part of the screen and you click on the interpretation option. And there you can choose to have it translated. Buenos días, un punto rápido sobre el idioma de la mesa. La mesa va a ser en inglés, pero si quieren oír una traducción simultánea, en la parte inferior de la pantalla está la opción interpretación. Si presionan ahí, pueden oír una traducción del inglés al español. Okay, so now we can get started. I think we have I hope we will have a very thought-provoking discussion, and we're honored really to be joined by 4 researchers who have been studying a range of topics, and I will let them introduce themselves in a bit. I just want to briefly state the structure of this panel. So we have 90 minutes, and so that you know what to expect. So first of all, so the panelists don't have any presentations. So this is not maybe like the other sessions. And the idea is to have more of a discussion based on their experience and to kind of pick their brains a bit to see where they see this emerging area going and what their interests are and what some of the challenges are, and kind of pick on their experience. And so first they will introduce themselves and they will give an opening statement. And then we will have around half an hour of discussion within the panel. And after that, there will be a closing statement and we will open the floor for participants. So if you have a question, I would suggest that you write it in the chat. And so at any point, and then we will get back to you. So we have around 20 minutes, 15 minutes at the end of the session for discussion. So you can just and if you would like to address any panelist in particular, I would suggest that you write the name. So this is for Sofia, this is for Dennis, so that they know, or this is for everyone. And the questions can be in Spanish or in English. So we're joined by 4 researchers. We have Sofia Gil-Clavel, who is a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. We have Ridi Kashyap from the Department of Sociology and the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science at the University of Oxford. Victoria Prieto from the Universidad de la República Uruguay. And we have Dennis Fian from UC Berkeley. So I will let them introduce themselves and maybe give an opening statement. So we can start in the order perhaps that I introduced you. So Sofia. And this opening statement that we have prepared is basically, I would like to know, in your opinion, what you think that the most important question is that we can answer using web and social media data that we could not answer otherwise. So Sofia, please.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, just as Diego said, my name is Sofia, and I am a PhD student at the Digital and Computational Laboratory of the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. I am affiliated at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And well, I have a bachelor on actuarial science from la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and a master on computer science from el Centro de Investigación en Matemáticas, also from Mexico. And well, after my master on computer science, I worked at el Consejo Nacional de Población in Mexico as head of the demographic analysis department. And well, my opening statement is that nowadays we have access to a lot of data, and considering data as more than numbers, it could be blog posts like from Reddit or from Twitter. Then if we consider this data as any type of information that is systematically collected, organized, and analyzed, then now we can answer questions that come, for example, from network theory which then evolve and touch areas like demography and sociology. And as an example, I would like to say 3 questions that one is next to each other. So how information is disseminated and consumed is something that now we can answer thanks of data from Twitter, for example. How is the spread of this information, how the spread of this information influences human behavior? And is this information polarizing societies? And then once these questions were formulated and studied, then they evolved to something like, how is the integration of immigrant communities affected by social polarization? So these are questions that we can answer now, thanks that we have data from Twitter, for example. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sofia.
You're muted.
Muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Sofia. Now we can have Riri.
Thanks very much, Diego, for organizing this panel. I'm really excited to be speaking to the community of Latin American population scientists. I'm Riri Kashyap, and I'm a demographer at the University of Oxford. I'm an associate professor of demography here at the university in the Department of Sociology and the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science. I'm also at Nuffield College, which is a specialized college in the social sciences. So I'm very excited at this moment in time to be a demographer when there's this digital revolution that's taking place, because I think the digital revolution affords new opportunities. So before I sort of talk about what I think are the new opportunities afforded by the digital revolution, I want to clarify what I mean by the digital revolution. The digital revolution, to my mind, is the spread of new technologies, in particular the internet and mobile phones, in roughly the last 2 decades, a little bit longer, that have really revolutionized what Sofia was saying, how we seek information, how we communicate with each other, which networks we're embedded in, as well as how we conduct our everyday life and access vital services. So in this time when we have this digital revolution that's ongoing, I think the digital revolution from a research perspective can be thought of in 2 ways. The digital revolution is first and foremost, it's a social revolution because of all these impacts it has on how we're doing things in our lives. But it's also a data revolution because it creates the digitalization of our lives, creates new kinds of data products. These are byproducts of our use of new kinds of technologies, such as the fact that everyone now has a mobile phone, and that creates these digital breadcrumbs that we leave behind. It also affords new ways of collecting data in ways that might be cost effective. And that is also something that's powerful, especially at times when face-to-face interactions, as is the case right now with the pandemic, is difficult to attain otherwise. So on both of those fronts, the fact that the digital revolution is a social revolution and it has impacts on our lives, including on important demographic processes. It's important to analyze the effects of new technologies and the fact that we can, through the use of web and social media data, as well as through the inclusion of new kinds of questionnaires about digital technologies within conventional demographic data sources, are both ways that we can analyze the ways in which the digital revolution is or promises to be a social revolution? And that's a question that in my research I've been very closely interested in lately. But the digital revolution, as I said, is also a data revolution. We need to figure out what this data revolution means and how we can leverage it appropriately. This requires, I think, a skill set that demographers have and are uniquely positioned to contribute to. And that's something that I hope we'll also talk about in this panel. So that's all for me for now, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Rudy, for a wonderful opening. And Victoria?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'd like to share a picture just during my presentation, if you don't mind. So, okay.
Yes, we can see it.
There it goes. It's just that. Okay, so first my introduction. So I am Victoria Prieto. I am a demographer and sociologist and have a very recent approach into digital demography. I work as an assistant professor at the University of de la Universidad de la República in the Programa de Población. And my main interest is international migration, and it's precisely because of that topic that I approach this kind of data. I am leading right now the research project, which is actually a partnership between the Max Planck Institute in Demographic Research and our institution. And the project is named it's focused on using digital traces and traditional data sources to address migration flows that are arriving in Uruguay, and to specifically examine the characteristics of these migrants and their social inclusion in Uruguay. And my opening statement, it's related to this picture that we can see right here, and it's more, sorry, the picture we're seeing right there is it's a collection of figures regarding the every minute use of data generated through these different apps, and I just marked 4 or 5 of them, which are Google, Tinder, Uber, Airbnb, and Twitter, which are some of the apps that are being used to address demographic issues here in Latin America. The other apps are also used in the demographic field, but are not as relevant for the Latin American population, or has not been used in the Latin American study of digital demography. And so I recall that Diego mentioned that one of the questions that he wanted us to address during the opening statement was, what is the most important question that we can answer using web or social media data? And in that regard, I would say that it's not necessarily a behavior, or my response is not necessarily a demographic behavior or a specific research question, but it's more about the opportunities that this digital revolution offers to gather and examine real-time data. I think that's what fascinates me the most in regard to this. And that's precisely why I chose a picture that points out the volume of data that is generated every minute. And this data logically does not replace traditional data sources, but it complements it very well, especially in the study of some behaviors such as internal or international migration, for which census, survey, or administrative record information is sporadic or has been insufficient in some cases. However, this type of data, not originally designed for statistical purposes, is still undergoing a quality assessment process that demands all demographers being engaged in that matter to validate it as a useful source for demographic research. So I want to drive your attention to the importance of introducing demographers into the gathering and handling of this data, as much as training them in measuring and examining the direction and impacts of the biases. As my colleague just pointed out, we are in a privileged position given to the toolbox that we normally handle as demographers, but still there is a need of training regarding programming and extraction of this data to take out the most or the best of these data source.
Great, thank you, Victoria. Last but not least, Dennis, please.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Dennis Vian, and I wanted to start by thanking Diego for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm excited to be here. It sounds like we're gonna have a great discussion. So I think for the first part, there's two. So I'll first sort of introduce myself, and then I'll talk a little bit about the question we were given. So I'm an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in the demography department, and I thought I'd talk about how I got to my interest in digital demography. So as an undergrad, I was very interested in computer science. I was actually a math major, but I spent a lot of time doing computer science stuff. And then after I graduated, I got interested in demography. But as a PhD student, I did an internship with the data science group at Facebook. And then after I finished my PhD, I did a brief postdoc with them before starting at Berkeley. And part of what I worked on there was trying to understand migration, and part of what I worked on was trying to understand how we can sample and interview people on Facebook using conventional survey methods, but in such a way that we might be able to learn about people who aren't just on Facebook. And then finally, at Berkeley, a lot of my teaching has been about social networks, which is kind of closely tied to some of the discussion on digital demography, and so I think about this stuff a fair amount. So that's me. So we were asked to think about what the most important question that we can answer using web or social media data is that we can't answer using some other way. And I actually think that probably the most important questions we can answer are about the web or social media data themselves. I mean, given the extent to, and this is something I think that we've heard from my colleagues on the panel here in different ways. There's a lot of exciting ways that web and social media data can be used to better understand classic demographic questions like migration or fertility, marriage, and so forth. But given the size and influence that social media has started to have in many populations, I think there are many questions about how the social media themselves operate that are super important and that we can answer only with these web and social media data. So maybe I'll leave that there and we can continue in the discussion, but that's fine.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Dennis. So as you can see, we have like a wide array of subjects and experiences in our panel. And so the way that I thought about this is that I gave these questions to the panelists and asked them to think about them. And but that doesn't mean that we cannot also discuss other things that you might think are interesting, right? So I think so many things came up now. I took some notes and we can get back to this. So please, so I would suggest that maybe we start discussing this question that I proposed, but of course feel free to go in any direction that you think could be interesting. And I would also encourage the audience, if you also want to jump in and add something, please feel free to do so in the chat. And I'll try and also find a way of incorporating your comments into discussion, if to the extent that it is possible. So thank you very much. That was the introductory part, and now we can move on to a discussion. So I asked the panelists to think about this question that I will post to the chat now. And the question is, the representativity of digital data is seriously compromised in low and middle income settings, characterized by lower internet penetration rates and larger inequalities in digital access. What are, in your opinion, the main challenges and opportunities for digital demography in this context. And of course, this is something that is very relevant for Latin America, where this is the case in many countries, and also across countries and within countries. So I open the floor. If you want to say something, please just feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to go first, if I may. I think this is a really important and a really interesting question. And as far as my own trajectory goes, I mean, I'm very interested in questions linked to sort of human development and population dynamics. I've done a lot of work in, for example, thinking about gender inequalities broadly, especially in the global South. And when in my sort of entry into digital demography, I actually entered it wondering, well, can we use these new kinds of digital traces that everyone was very excited about in the context of high income countries? Could we also use them to analyze phenomena in the context of low and middle income countries? So that was actually my sort of point of entry into analyzing questions linked to gender inequality and also demographic processes. So from my vantage point, and this sort of links a bit with what Dennis was just alluding to in his comment, I think the first and foremost step is that, is to actually do a sort of thorough demographic analysis of online populations, right? And to understand to what extent, who are we capturing, what can we capture, and what are the kinds of what's the kind of the sort of scope of analysis that's possible here. And that requires, even though it sounds very preliminary, right? So sometimes the best social science starts with good, simple description, and the best digital demography also starts in that way, with really just sort of enumerating in whatever ways we can with the kind of imperfect data avenues that we have, who is online by age, by gender, by other characteristics, like purely demographic analysis, and then using that as a sort of stepping stone to both quantify and illuminate the kinds of biases that exist in online populations in terms of digital access. And that has both sort of an important role to play, both in terms of understanding sort of the nature of online populations, but also, if, as I was saying in my opening statement, if we say that digital technologies are meaningful for human development dynamics now, then we need to also understand these accesses and these biases. So understanding digital inequalities is a very fundamental part of understanding how inequalities operate, because online and offline inequalities are highly interlinked in this world. So we will not get onto that task unless we first understand the nature of online inequalities. And that's how in my work I became very interested in digital gender inequalities. And we put together digitalgendergaps.org, which tries to monitor using online, so from data from Facebook's marketing API, what are gender gaps in internet and mobile use, because that's, to my mind, is a really important measure of inequality. And unsurprisingly, places where there are structural gender inequalities in the offline world, we also see them in the online world. And that, for me, is a very, very telling sign that these things are interlinked.
Thanks. Thanks, Rudy. That's a great point. I just sent the link to the website. I think that's a great project if you don't know it and if you haven't read the paper. Thanks. Yeah. So would someone else like to say something? Yeah, please, Victoria.
Yeah. I haven't thanked you for the organization of the roundtable and the invitation also. Thank you very much for that. Well, in my opinion, the challenges in this region in particular, I will speak from my specific field, which is international migration. But the challenges I foresee, or we have been facing in the team here in Uruguay, to deal with digital traces and to take the best from it, are related to some of the characteristics of the platforms that offer access to this kind of data. For example, speaking of the Facebook API application in particular, we figure out that some national origins are not included in the list of variables that Facebook has, for instance, for expats, which is a particular tagging used by the app. And in some cases, these groups are a very large share of the total immigrant population in some countries. Let's bring up the case of Argentina, for instance, where Bolivian community is a very big community, and for that community, without any specific reason, we don't have any data about them as expats. We have data on Facebook users in Bolivia, but we don't have data on expats from that origin in particular. Same happened also with Cuba, for instance. In some cases, we also don't have data on that. So that brings up like an additional layer of biases to our studies, because it's leaving aside a big part of the migrant population in the region. Then the other challenge that we are facing is, as everyone has mentioned already, I mean, we acknowledge that there are biases, but we want to measure them and examine their direction, no, and understanding in which ways that they are affecting our data. But the challenge here is that we don't necessarily have the ground or truth data that we would like to have to conduct those analyses. So it's wonderful to read papers from the US or from Europe where people are able to compare what we have regarding trends on mobility, let's say, for the immigration that arrives in those contexts. But we don't necessarily have registered data on or annual surveys that provide that kind of ground data to do the same analysis, comparing what we get from Facebook, let's say, or other apps, or let's say Google searches, and what are actual flows. So that is kind of frustrating somehow, and also drives our attention to inequalities again, because this region has recently engaged in the digital revolution, but still it's processing another, not revolution, but it's still behind in the production of traditional data sources. So as always happens for middle and low income countries, you get engaged into a revolution, but you still haven't finished or completed another revolution, which is prior to that one. So challenges here are double, in my opinion.
Yeah, and there is also the problem of the problem that you mentioned about the lack of baseline data, and the fact that those people who are more likely to be excluded from the offline are also excluded from the online. So like the most marginalized, like the most invisible, we don't really see also in the online data. Sophia, please, and I would. So maybe before we move to Sophia, Victoria, could you very quickly explain, maybe for people who are not very familiar with how you do research with Facebook, like what that actually means when you mention that like some origins are not included and the API, like just very briefly, what are we speaking about?
Me or Sophia? Okay, because I learned this from Sophia, so I thought. Okay. I thought the question was posed to her, but. Well, I mean, as I just said, thanks to this partnership with the Lab in Digital and Computational Demography and to the contact I had the fortune to have with Sophia, we learned how to conduct this analysis. And so what we are basically using is the Facebook API, which is just a platform to get into the background of Facebook. And it enables us through a programmatic way to extract daily or monthly data on the number of users of Facebook, and this tool has been developed by Facebook originally as a marketing tool. It's just the tool that you use when you want to post an ad on, let's say I am netting something and I want to promote that I'm netting sweaters, and so everyone can use this tool to post an ad, but we can also use it as a tool to target specific population groups. So it's a fantastic tool to target what Facebook has labeled as expats, which is people that was living in a certain community before, and now they're enumerated or allocated into a different community. It's something like what we call stocks in demography, and the same information that we can gather from census or survey data, but imagine that you can conduct that census and survey data every day. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so now we can move to Sophia, who has trained a generation of Facebook researchers.
So hi, yeah, I also didn't say thank you, Diego, for inviting me. So thank you. So yeah, just talking about what Ridi already mentioned and Victoria was also talking about. So I felt that one of the main concerns that computer scientists have is that information systems have not been designed for everyone. So something that you were saying about how people are not represented. Well, this comes because minority groups are not represented in big tech companies, so like Google and Facebook. So I guess that the point that I'm trying to make is that if minority groups like indigenous women keep experiencing structural oppression, then the chances that they scale in the power structures are really low, and therefore the chances that information systems consider their opinions and necessities will also remain low. So I feel that one of the challenges is to make information systems inclusive, but this comes not only from the tech companies, but also from our own countries. You know, this is just something that is there in Latin America and is happening, and it's something that needs to be challenged from the roots. And well, I don't know if you also already asked about the advantages of using the data, or we are also just talking about the challenges.
You can speak about the advantages as well.
Okay, yeah, because otherwise everybody's going to think that there are just challenges and problems, but there are also nice things about the data. So if we think of internet as a tool that leverages freedom of communication and signifies the free flow of ideas, opinions, and knowledge, then I feel that internet is a great platform to look for alternative sources. So we have the Facebook Marketing API, we have Twitter, we have Reddit, we have a lot of different platforms that give us new perspectives and also give us like new ways to compare data that we already have in Latin America. So in this sense, as an example, I am working now with Ivan Williams from the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina, in a project in which we use obituaries that are online as a source to compare the coverage of death registers in small areas in Argentina. So it's just like, as Victoria was saying, so for me, the opportunities that digital data brings in this context is access to data against which we can compare or just complement data from Latin America.
Great, thank you, Sophia.
Right.
Yep.
Great. Excellent. Yeah, so thank you everyone for an interesting conversation. I made some notes to myself beforehand, and I think we've talked about most of the things that I was going to mention, but I agree with what several of my fellow panelists have said. I think the importance of inequality is paramount, and I really like how Victoria linked the importance of inequality and the difficulty in obtaining some kind of gold standard with which to measure the social media data against. And one thing we can, can be a very difficult task, but one thing we can work on is trying to improve the number of ways that there is a gold standard to compare to. And maybe that involves something like adding or lobbying for adding questions to national surveys that can help us better align the work that we want to do with the social media data up with the more conventional probability samples. Maybe it involves working on trying to understand how to sample people to interview them directly online and compare what they tell us in a more conventional interview with the sort of estimates that we would get from the API about them. And I think that there's a lot of that's both a challenge and an opportunity because it's an opportunity in the sense that I think there's a lot of things that demographers can probably productively contribute to figuring out how to do that. And I think that'll be really important to help us mitigate some of the ways that just taking social media data at face value can be, can imply that we're making big assumptions in some cases, especially in populations where the diffusion of the internet or the social media use is not near complete. And I just kind of one other basically, I agree with everything my panelists have said. One other thing, though, I kind of wanted to mention is I think someone earlier alluded to how a big strength of these data is that the resolution, at least in principle, the resolution that we're able to get is often very high compared to the data that we're used to. So resolution in a lot of different ways. So it could be in terms of time. Sophia just mentioned a project that she's working on trying to produce small area estimates. So I assume that resolution is kind of related to space. So there's a lot of ways that we can get much finer grained information potentially from social media data. And I think that's sort of a challenge and an opportunity because I think, I mean, and I'd be interested to hear if everyone else agrees, as demographers, we actually don't have an amazing number of theories that let us take advantage of very high resolution data. And that's something that is maybe an opportunity. Maybe that's something that we should work on, is trying to, you know, I think to some extent the kind of ideas and theories that we work with are a byproduct of what we think it might be possible to eventually empirically test. And the fact that these data are relatively new, I think means that some of the ways that we've thought about population processes have been implicitly contingent on the survey and census data that we've historically been able to access. And I think now that there's the possibility of learning about things at a higher resolution, that might require us to think theoretically a little bit more, which is yeah, which I think is a pretty big opportunity. This is maybe more of a medium term. This is not, you know, something that will happen over the next year, but I think this is an opportunity for us as a discipline over the next, you know, 10 years. So.
Thanks, Dennis. So if anyone wants to react, please feel free just to jump in. So otherwise, so something that came up in the discussion and was just emphasized now by Dennis, but I think in one way or another, all the panelists mentioned it, was that demographers have something special to bring to this digital revolution, like really described it, and that like it is really important that we are involved and we have like something unique to contribute. And so I would like to hear your thoughts, like what is that particular thing that like we as demographers can bring to the table that like a data scientist, for example, would not be able to do? Like what is our kind of strength, and why are we in a position of strength in this respect? Yep.
Okay. Well, from my from a couple of encounters that I have had with data scientists, I figure out that first of all, they're a very open community. They are looking for research questions and asking for research questions. They know all the potential they have in the scrapping of the data, the handling of the data, the handling of unstructured data also. But many of them feel that they don't have the proper questions to ask to the data. So they rely very much on the advice of demographers. They rely and they're eager to listen to social scientists to contribute to that. And in my personal experience, we joined two engineers into the group because both of them were just looking for topics or looking for researchers conducting the field, which is very surprising. That doesn't happen to demographers in general. People just saying to you, I have the data, I have the tools, but I don't have questions. So that's the first thing. The first thing I would say is that we know which questions need to be asked. And then we are very much aware of the biases that these kind of data has, because we know data sources with universal enumeration of the population. So we know how much spread inequalities are and to which groups they affect in particular. And we also are aware of the overlaying or the intersection of different layers of inequality. Sophia just put an example. She was speaking about women that are also coming from indigenous community. Well, we have like two intersections of population segmentation, that are acting in place. So that's one of the things. Second thing is the handling of some methods in particular, like diff and diff analysis, or things that we are quite much used, the standardization of data. We are quite much used to that. Having a special eye for the cohort composition of things, or the different age structure of things, and how much simple things such as age and sex bias any analysis. So I would say those are some of the tools we have.
Thanks, Victoria. Rudy, I think you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I did, and actually it follows on quite well with from the points that Victoria was just making. I mean, I completely agree that to some extent within the sort of broader field of the broader growing field of computational social science, I think, you know, we have to remember if computational social science is only going to work if it's both computation but also social science. So sort of domain expertise, as computer scientists call it, really matters, right? It matters that we bring in the kind of perspectives and theories and sort of the intuitions that we have as social scientists, and we bring them to the fore in the analysis of both digital phenomena, but also digitalized byproducts that are data byproducts of digitalization. So in a sense, I completely agree that, you know, sort of thinking about how we analyze social phenomena, but also the fact that you know, to try and create a bridge between not purely just analyzing data for data's sake, but doing it with a sort of constructive purpose and question, that's something that social scientists can bring to the fore. But I think the other thing, not just sort of asking good questions, but also doing good measurement is something where demographers really, I feel, have the opportunity to contribute. Because, I mean, if you think about in the broader sense what demography is, right? Demography is like good population generalizable measurement. It's about how can we do good population generalizable measurement, but often from imperfect data sources, right? There's a whole tradition of demographic analysis, a la William Brass, Ridley Schofield, and others, right? Who, whether they're working with sort of incomplete parish records, or whether they're working with faulty censuses from Africa from the middle of the 20th century, there's this whole tradition of demographic analysis, sometimes also called indirect estimation, but also other kinds of techniques that have been very much focused on good measurement, or what can we say within reasonable bounds, but with population scales at stake. So this is something that I think demographers can really bring to the fore, in that when we are analyzing things, you know, we can say we might not be able to measure absolutes, but maybe we can measure ratios, and ratios will tell us something meaningful. So for example, in the work that I started doing, studying digital gender inequalities, we realized that yes, Facebook was not the whole world of internet users, but if we measured ratios on Facebook, in fact, I'm very interested in female to male ratios, also in the offline world, because I've studied phenomena like sex selection, sex selective abortion, sex discrimination. So I thought, well, if I look at sex ratios in the offline world, what happens if I look at sex ratios on the online world, right? And does that give me a measure of gender inequality? And is that measure better measured online than if I were just looking at some kind of absolute number, right? So this idea of like, how do we measure, and also what can we appropriately measure given the data that we have, is something that demography has a really long tradition of. And I think that's something that we really have the scope to, in some sense, reinvent those techniques, but for new data sources.
Yeah, thanks, Rudy. Yeah, that's a very good point. Focus on measurement. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I could say I wholeheartedly agree with Rudy and Victoria. I think yeah, I mean, I think demographers' comparative advantage is often that we don't take data at face value, even relative to other social scientists. And I think that's essentially what Victoria and Rudy were saying. So.
Okay. So would you like to add something, Sophia?
No, I think that they just summarize everything. I don't have anything else to say. Yeah, I completely agree with Victoria's point that sometimes data scientists don't have a question, and that's terrible because they have like all the methodologies. And I really felt that it was my case when I started my PhD. I was like super excited about data, like, wow, what am I going to do with this? And then, you need to have like a question because otherwise you're just not going anywhere. So yeah. That's all.
Diego, if I may, I just want to make one sort of related point as well, which is that, I said demographers are really good at sort of population generalizable measurement, but the other thing that demographers are really good at is the discovery of empirical regularities, right, at scale, right? So that's another really great thing that demographic analysis is all about telling us how is life expectancy been growing and going for what's the trend been for a really long time. And the fact that it's been linear for a really long period of time is like a strikingly common and regular phenomenon in a way that is unprecedented in the social sciences, right? So these kinds of things are things that demographers in different ways, whether it's the analysis of mortality and fertility or migration, the fact that age patterns are so regular across mortality, fertility, migration, across time and space. Yes, we can scale them up and down a bit as parametric models will allow us to do, but at the same time, there are all these empirical regularities that demographers have talked about a lot, right? And that kind of analysis of kind of discovery of empirical regularities in some sense can be, as I said, reinvented also in the context of new kinds of data sources. So those are two sort of features of demographic analysis: scrutiny and data quality, and the discovery of empirical regularities, macro level empirical regularities in particular, are two features of, I think, demographic analysis that lend themselves into the digital era quite well.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's also very beautifully put, this idea of discovering empirical regularities at scale. I think that's a great description of what we try to do as demographers. So I would I would like to transition to the closing part of our discussion, and so just as a reminder, I ask you to think a bit about the future and answer the question, like, what next for digital demography? So we keep saying that this is an emerging field, but so there are people whose entire careers have been focused on this. So it is also starting to become a more established field. And so maybe like one criteria for seeing whether something is emerging or not is that if there are institutions that are exclusively dedicated to that kind of research. And there are indeed. So Sophia and me, for example, are based on the Laboratory of Digital and Computational Demography. So it is kind of more and more part of a certain mainstream. So I would really be interested to know or to hear what your thoughts are. Like, what should an agenda be for digital and computational demography, for studies using web and social media data? And maybe, so demography has been historically kind of very close to praxis, in the sense that many demographers have also worked with the government, and they're like very empiric, very practical issues that need that population policies address, and I think more so in Latin America than in other settings, where kind of the exercise of social science has not been as close to what we think of as a European or a US academia, but has this very strong empirical component. So like in this setting, so what do you see as being the future of this sub-discipline? And it's an open question, so whoever wants to go first. Yeah.
Okay. Right. This is a very hard question. So I'm just going to bring up one little one little thing that I think might increasingly change over the future, which is that I think over the next decade, it will be increasingly the case that there are people with training as demographers who work in some of the industry that produces a lot of the data that we're interested in working with. which is a little bit somewhat new, I think, to demographers. We're fairly accustomed, I believe, as a discipline to working with folks who have roles in government, but it's and beyond demography, kind of a feature of these new data is that ultimately we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges of working with data that we get from an API and how it can be unclear, why some decisions were made about the categories that are used or how the measurement is done. That measurement may change. So basically, I think as more demographers are on the production side of those data, I wonder how, as a discipline, we can try to incorporate those people into our kind of academic and intellectual discussions. I think that's something that's worth thinking about for the, how are we going to sort of, and this is a question that goes beyond demography. It sort of has computer science seems to have done a pretty good job of figuring this out, but I think the social sciences, as far as I can tell, are still wrestling a little bit with how we can collaborate with these companies, or how we can kind of answer some of the sort of questions that I think Victoria raised in some of her examples about how the API data for migrants were difficult to kind of square with the questions that she's interested in. So that's one thing in the future. I think increasingly demographers will be on the inside of these companies, and what can we, how can we kind of take advantage of that, or what as a discipline, how should we plan for that?
Dennis, maybe just to follow up on that. So do you see this as being like a more fluid kind of relationship where academics would like work maybe at a tech company for a while before going to academia? Or because I feel like these transitions from like industry to academia tend to be kind of permanent, or maybe the other way around, like from academia to the industry.
Yeah, so I certainly think what you mentioned specifically, which is as part of PhD training or right after PhD, this was my experience, certainly personally, and I know a few other people who've done this kind of thing. So I think that's probably the easiest thing to do right now. I'm not sure if it will ever be easier to transition back and forth. I mean, my impression, Diego, I'd be curious if my other panelists agree, but yeah, my impression is that it's a little bit easier to transition from academia to industry, but that it tends to be a little bit difficult to come back once you've made that transition. And I don't know, it's hard to see why that would change in the future, although perhaps it will. But I guess I wonder if we'll find a way to develop partnerships with people who aren't necessarily interested in returning to academia as demographers, but who, sort of analogous to someone who works at a National Census Bureau. Those people come to PAA and sometimes publish in our journals and participate in our kind of intellectual community, but they're, they don't have positions at universities or research institutions. They're government officials, at least they are in the US. So yeah, I mean, I wonder if there's some model like that we could develop in demography.
Thanks. Riti.
So I think the sort of points that Dennis has raised are really, really both interesting and also relevant for thinking about sort of the future development of the field, not just from the sort of perspective of, well, I agree with him that I think this is going to be the future, and that there's a lot of demand across, for example, large companies, especially large technology companies, for good social science expertise broadly. And I think that's necessary. And that's necessary because, we can't just have pure technologists handling really large social platforms. We need, social researchers and the kinds of skills that social researchers bring, and a diversity of social researchers in those platforms, also to echo the points that Sophia was making. I think, linked to the point, of course, this could also allow for sort of more transparent, hopefully, models of data access and data collaboration than what exists at the moment, right? I think one of the big open and big if questions for the development of digital demography is that there's very limited still streams of public transparent data access because these are essentially commercial stakeholders, and they don't really care so much about research in the same way that we do as research scientists. So both their standards for data as well as their models for data sharing and what they hope to get out of their data are very different from what we hold for ourselves. And trying to create sort of partnerships that allow for transparent modes of data access that also fit in with our visions of what we want to do with it, but also the broader currents in the scientific community about openness, reproducibility, and so on, right? There's a tension there between having proprietary data and these kind of openness, reproducibility, scientific currents that we're also experiencing. So trying to find a way that both of those things can be feasibly realized in ways that are still privacy preserving is something that I think a lot of work that is still evolving, and I don't think there's a sort of a clear template for that as yet. So, but leaving aside the issue of sort of, okay, we will want to rely on, and we should have different models and develop models of relying on commercial data and find ways to do that. There's the other side, which is that I really think that we as researchers who use, especially sort of in the demographic community, one of the really strong features of the demographic research community is our reliance on sort of large, publicly available population data sets, survey data sets, and census data sets, right? Often these are in the public domain, can be accessed. And this is actually a real strength of the discipline, right? But in these kinds of large-scale surveys, for example, like the Demographic and Health Survey, or a range of different aging and health surveys that exist, I think we need to start thinking more creatively about the kinds of measures that we can embed in there that allow us to leverage the digital revolution, right? So we need to also, and we've been doing this already, right? So if we think about, for example, survey data now versus survey data like 30 years ago, it's very different, right? Survey data has, for example, a range of sort of, GIS coordinates now that it didn't in the past that allow for the incorporation of contextual geographic information. That's been a huge boon for the research community. Similarly, a lot of health and aging studies now include physiological measures, biomarkers, which is something that really has only happened in the last 20 years, but have also revolutionized how we think, not just about mortality, but also morbidity, for instance, right? Because we have these pathways that we can analyze now. So in a sense, we've made survey data richer with features like biological features or geographic features. So I think I'd like for us to also start thinking about the development of new modes of data collection so that we can also incorporate different kinds of digital signatures and digital features within our existing surveys. So truthfully, I don't see the digital revolution as the end of surveys, right? But I think the digital revolution is the augmentation of surveys in ways that I think we have still in no way capitalized on, right? We can look at new features of mobility through accelerometers. We can look at other kinds of things linked to the ambient environment, energy consumption. These are all things now that we have the technology at scale to be able to integrate into our surveys, right? There are, of course, questions linked to ethics and trying to figure out how that will work. But at the same time, ultimately, I think enriching our existing well-tested and tried instruments of data collection, but augmenting them with new kinds of features, new digital signatures that are afforded by new technologies, in the same way that we've been able to do with, for example, biomarkers or GIS. Just extending that forward, I think, is a real boon that would help the development and also help us answer some of these questions of bias and representativity in new ways, because they would be embedded in probability samples, which we still trust.
Thanks, Riti. Someone else want to comment?
Okay. Well, thank you for this question, which was food for thought for me during breakfast today. I've been going over it, and I really appreciate what my colleagues here have been saying. The point that really was bringing out is this: what is best is to think of these expansion of demography towards private companies that produce this data, or is it to promote partnerships between academy and these companies? I would support the second point much more than the first choice, because I acknowledge the existence of this tension that that my colleague previously mentioned between the commercial interest and marketing interest that is behind these companies, the search for profit of these companies, which really goes, really contradicts in many cases the pursuit of knowledge or the kind of interest that move us demographers, most of us working from the academy or even from the governments. So I would say that it is easier to think of demography as embedded in governments than thinking of it as embedded in companies. I would say that that's really an epistemological and thing that would be very disruptive for the discipline. So I mean, now that the colleagues have pointed out this, I think that I will be more comfortable for the sake of the knowledge that we pursue to move into the field of the partnerships. The other thing is that as someone from Latin America or from the Latin American community of demographers, I think that the future of this faces us with two challenges. The first one might be to contribute in reducing the gap between the global north and the global south in terms of training and resources to conduct scientific research using this kind of tools. I would call my colleagues from the region to join this conversation, for which we are quite behind in Latin America demography, by promoting partnerships with these international fellows, with partnership with these companies that have whole departments of research actually, and then building bridges with digital demography itself by training our human resources into the programming and the tools and methodological tools that we use in digital demography. To train demographers from Latin America into programming tools, it's really something that we are needing, and it's something that we are layering behind. And that definitely is one of the challenges that the discipline has in many countries from the South. And then also to overcome the generational gap that we may have in this as a community. I still consider myself a young demographer, and I really feel like a big distance with the generations that came later than mine. So I was trained in the same institute that two of you are working, and we didn't have the kind of training that people are having right now. So imagine to have a conversation with demographers that are 50, 60 years old. It's challenging to do that. So I think we still have, as a community, at least those two challenges, like to generalize the programming tool and the tools that we need to actually take out the best of this data, and to do that, not letting anyone behind, even from our own community. So that's one thing. And the other thing that I also see as a challenge for the future is to develop strategies to assess a population that is extremely segmented within it. Like the global South population is segmented by itself. It's very different from what the population of the global North, but it's very unequal internally. So that's also an extra challenge in demography in general, but in this using this kind of tools in particular, because it demands from us tagging and labeling of the data that is maybe more, that is maybe not included in the platforms per se, because what we were saying before, like the exclusion of populations that are excluded from the market, excluded from capitalism, that is a big challenge, because there is no online incentives for the companies to conduct research on them or to provide tagging on them, because they are simply not the ideal consumers. So that's mainly what I think about the future.
It's great. Thank you, Victoria. Thanks for making those points. And I think we will come back to them after we're done with this section. Sophia?
Yeah, so when you ask what's the future of digital demography, I was mostly thinking from a computer science perspective. That is that I feel that researchers and developers now are working on combating the bias on the algorithms and the representatives of the training data, and also the ethics behind the use of the data, also from social network sites. And I feel that there is still a lot of work to do on that regard. So for example, Ridi was mentioning the biomarkers, and somehow I feel that there is a lot of things that have to be considered. Like, yeah, we have a lot of data to recognize who is there just by using a camera, but do we really want to do this? Is this something that it's ethically right? So these are things that we are still thinking and that are there and that has to be considered. And then, but if I only focus on the representatives of the data, then I think that there should be more people from non-Western societies or countries using the data, just as Victoria said, because otherwise we don't know what we are missing, like we don't know what we are not considering or what these big tech companies should know, like we know that the algorithms are biased because someone from a minority started to check in Google, like just writing things like Black women and then checking what the search engine said, but it was someone from a minority that pointed that out. So if we don't have people from minorities saying this out loud, then we are just not working to fix how things work now. So I feel that we need more people from non-Western countries working with the data and pointed out the problems that that big tech companies are just not considering because they don't have the incentives to do it. So that's like what I wanted to say. Like, I just feel that the future of digital demography is or should be having more people from non-Western societies asking questions to the data and checking what is there.
That's great. Thank you, Sophia. So many points. So what I would try to do now is to give a very brief and incomplete summary of some of the points that we have covered before opening up the floor for discussion with the other participants in the room. And this is not going to be in any particular order, but I think it's probably good to start with this idea of the digital revolution that Ridi introduced, and something that came out during the discussion that I found very interesting was that the digital revolution has created a new population that didn't exist before, right? So that's clearly one thing that we can study using digital methods that we could not study otherwise. Like before the digital revolution, there was no online population. And this population is in itself, so it's interesting for at least two reasons. The first, because it is a new population and like we are also part of that. And it's kind of just interesting to know how it behaves in itself and like for the sake of the population. But as Ridi mentioned, it also, like comparing that to like our real baseline population, reveals patterns, reveals inequalities. It says something about our societies, and even looking within the population. So like these ratios, sex ratios within the online population also says something about the offline world, right? So this is one thing. but as Victoria mentioned, there is also this inequality in the production of the data, right? So that maybe people in countries of the global south are not as well trained to engage with this data, but they are also faced with the task of managing data that is poorer in quality, that is less abundant, that has more biases than other data, right? So this is like this double burden that we have to deal with if we want to make meaningful research on our territories. And Dennis also pointed out that this digital revolution can also allow us to grow as a discipline, in that we can develop new theories to kind of address this new level of this new resolution that we can obtain, both like temporally but also geographically. And so this can be also an opportunity for the discipline to grow. Well, something that I was also very interested in discussing was what we can bring as demographers, as social scientists, and there is something that really mentioned that I really liked, is that there is demand for good social science in the industry as well. And maybe you have seen now there, like at Facebook, for example, there seem to be many job openings for demographers to come in and also help designing surveys and these kind of things. And having people on the inside, as it were, is something that is very important. And as Sophia mentioned, also having a diverse group can help inform the kind of data that is produced, how it is produced, and maybe also this kind of movement back and forth, like Dennis mentioned, like from academia to the industry and the other way around. And as demographers, we can bring this very strong tradition of measurement and thinking about bias and forms of addressing bias. Something else that another opportunity is the opportunity to improve our offline data collection methods. Something that, unfortunately, we didn't really have time to follow up was Denny's suggestion of how we can also use some network concepts and methods, and how we can use things that we have learned from the online and apply them in surveys in the offline. But there are many opportunities, like Rudy mentioned, and that have already happened, like including geolocated data or linking with some other type of information. So this is also affecting the offline data collection, and it is unlikely to replace traditional methods, right? So that's also something very important that I have heard many colleagues emphasize. And maybe to finish this summary, I think something that the panelists underlined was the need to build bridges. I think Victoria used that expression. So bridges between researchers and private companies, between the global north and the global south. Also because of this inequality of skills, that maybe like we have interesting questions, but we don't necessarily have the training to access this data, like dealing with APIs, like the whole programming thing can be very challenging. And so training, for example, can be an opportunity. And that can help, as Sophia mentioned, kind of bring this diversity into the field. So that is the end of my summary. Something else that we didn't have time to cover but that Sophia brought up is the issue of ethics and how we rely on the kindness of strangers when we use this data from private companies. And so like we don't really know when they're gonna cut off this supplies of information, when it's gonna change, and so we are very much. It's not the same relationship that we have with the government, which, like Rudy mentioned, is kind of what we're used to. But so these are some things that we can also discuss in this last half an hour, this last 20 minutes, 15 minutes. But so I would like to open the floor now. If anyone has a question or a comment, please feel free to write it in the chat. And then we can address it. So in the meantime, also, if there are any reactions to what I just said or something else that you wanted to add from the panelists, please feel free to speak up.
Diego, I just wanted to say that was an excellent summary. I thought you covered all of the really sort of all of the themes, and your note-taking skills are fantastic. I just wanted to make a point about, sort of one recurring theme on this panel has been sort of, thinking also about what sort of digital inequalities and online inequalities mean, not just from the perspective of sort of their implications for the offline world, but also what they mean for the measurement of online processes linked to the diffusion of information and so on, which are obviously vitally important now and happen in that space. But, this is a point that I think Dennis made very early on in the panel, which is that, we really need to, in order to sort of size up some of these issues linked to how can we do good measurement, in a lot of our sort of standard bread and butter instruments of demographic research, like standard surveys in sort of standard censuses, I really think we need to start actively including questions on digital technology use, right? And so as a part of our project on digital gender gaps, one of the first things we did was we did a really thorough systematic review of where are questions on internet and mobile access by gender and age collected, right? Where we actually, not just a sort of, does the household have this? Because of course we know that there are intra-household inequalities, that we shouldn't take these things for granted. So we found that actually there were big data gaps in this. And so in a sense, the digital revolution had been happening and we were asleep. And I think that's something that, we kind of I keep coming back to this in sort of in my research, is because I see this as a kind of missed opportunity for the past, but at least for the past in relation to, a lot of the global north, where maybe some of these technological diffusion processes are in some sense already saturated. But in places of the world where these processes are still ongoing, it's not too late to start embedding these questions into our data collection tools. So for example, now starting phase 7, the DHS started including questions on internet and mobile use, which, for example, has been which has been fantastic and has, I think, opened up the opportunity to ask a lot of questions about sort of how, for example, the use of mobile phones affects knowledge about contraception or affects access to antenatal care. Questions that have been asked, for example, a lot in the field that I work in. So, these are kinds of questions where, so much of, for example, in demographic research, the questions about fertility change, right? There's been a recognition that diffusion matters, diffusions of ideas, diffusion of norms, all of these things matter, but a lot of that diffusion is going to happen through these technologies now. They're going to be the nodes of this diffusion. So we really need to incorporate in the tools that we use to do this analysis, these questions about it. So this is not so much a question of like, well, is this web and social media data? It's about the use of the web being embedded in our standard tools. And I think that is really an important part of trying to unravel these kinds of questions moving forward too.
Yeah, that's a great point, really. Thanks. So I don't see any questions yet, but please do write them in the chat if you would like to take part in the discussion. And I would just like to follow up on what you mentioned, really. And I think this is something that is happening more and more, this shift towards seeing digital use no longer as a privilege or as like an interesting activity, but really as an integral part of life that is just linked to basically all the processes that we are interested in. And I think you mentioned that during your introduction, how this data revolution is also, or was also, a social revolution. And that's something that is definitely worth exploring.
Yeah, no, and I think that sort of, for too long, digital inequalities have been sort of the domain of work for media and communication scholars, right? And we know from the history of, if I think about research in sort of, for example, thinking about issues linked to fertility or gender inequalities and women's empowerment, right? There's work that already shows, as I said, within this broader strand of work looking at diffusion and ideational theories of fertility decline, they talk a lot about, for example, currents of mass media and how they sort of shape globalized narratives or how they affect people's aspirations and norms, right? And in the past, we could only theorize about this, but not actually measure it. And now we have the opportunity to actually be able to measure these nodes of where these kinds of information diffusion processes are taking place.
I just want to raise a point. I've been going over my thoughts and I just concluded that maybe it was too pessimistic about the digital revolution, and I'm actually an optimist about it. And so I want to prove that by saying this. First of all, I really believe the resolution of the data and the timely data. That's the most amazing thing that this brings up, and it's hard to think of disadvantages of it that can, let's say, black out these shiny advantages. Even the biases, that is something that worry us very much, and that's definitely the main issue of the digital demography or of the analysis that has been done in digital demography. It's something that we demographers, as really mentioned before, we have always faced that. I mean, it's something that even census enumerators face every time. They use satellite images to count populations where these populations are uncountable or unreachable. They invest a lot of resources on deploying forces in the fieldwork to get access to isolated populations. So that's something that we have been working on or dealing with for very much long. We use survey data, labor force data, labor force surveys for analyzing labor market. And just to put an example, here in Latin America, labor force survey excludes people living in collective dwellings. These for international migration itself, it's a big challenge because especially in Argentina, in Chile, and in Uruguay, most of the recently arrived migrants live even for more than a year in these collective dwellings, like sharing shelters and things like that. And so we have a large underestimation of migrants and in this survey data and in the register data, and we managed to identify that we have a larger stock of migrants, precisely thanks to Facebook and other apps. Also, we find out that sometimes there are populations that simply don't want to be outreached, and that's something we also need to understand. And it happens online and it happens offline. Like we have the chance last year to conduct a survey among 4 migrant communities. This year using Facebook, and 1 year prior using face-to-face approach, using respondent-driven sampling, which is a kind of technique that protects very much anonymity and confidentiality in the population. And for we have the same groups of population, different approaches, digital one and face-to-face, and we ended up having the same results. We have population which turn out to be very responsive to both the face-to-face and the online, like the Venezuelans, for instance. But then we also have a community that was hard to reach anyway, and that it's a population that has the right to kept in that way, to kept as a hard to reach population. Let's say the Dominican Republic, for instance, here. And so the systematic comparison between traditional research and the research that we can conduct using this also validates a lot the potential of digital demography, and sometimes points out to the fact that simply quantitative research doesn't open all the doors to access on knowledge and information on certain population groups. So it's not a matter of online or offline. It's bigger than that. So that's something I think we need to bear in mind also, to mild the criticism on digital on the research conducted based on digital crimes.
Thanks, thanks, Victoria. So we have to start wrapping up, and I would say maybe one way to do that is Beatriz Gonzalez would like to know, apart from Facebook, which is a tool that we have discussed, like what are other tools that we can use or sources that we could use to do digital data. So maybe I would like to ask you, like, what's like your favorite, your like most exciting data source that like you would like really like to use or like to see more research on?
So I use the application programming interfaces. I use the Facebook one and I also use the Twitter one, but also another source of data that I found really useful is the Internet Archive. So, I mean, I feel that that data is just amazing. They have data since 2009, I think, from different websites. So if anyone is interested, I can just put it in the chat.
Thanks, Sophia.
Sure, I can go next, Diego. So I guess, like, you know, I think of sort of, I don't think of these as like necessarily digital data tools, but sort of different kinds of digital data sets, or let's call them data opportunities that are enabled by the digital revolution. So in my work so far, I've used some of the APIs that Sophia was talking about from Facebook, Facebook's marketing API, the Twitter API. I've also recently launched earlier in the year in a project. We used a chat bot to ask questions in a Telegram messenger channel to conduct a survey, which I thought was a sort of a unique way to get information about, you know, COVID-related behaviors. So that was just a good new data opportunity enabled because of, you know, not being able to do face-to-face interviews as well at that time. Other sources, of course, and I keep coming back to this, is, for example, the fact that now with the demographic and health surveys, we have GIS, geocoordinates, geographical coordinates available, means that we can actually merge a lot of interesting climate-related or environmental data sets to DHS clusters, which is, for example, even for Latin America, a really powerful tool. And I think that's the kind of sort of data linkage where you're merging a sort of a satellite data set to a survey data set, as we did in a paper that we published earlier in the year, looking at the effects of mobile phones on sustainable development outcomes using the DHS merged with satellite data. This is also an example of some of the kind of new kinds of data that are offered.
Thanks, Julie. So we have 2 minutes. So yeah, Dennis, please.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going to recommend. So my PhD advisor was Matt Seljanik, who's a sociologist at Princeton, and he's written a book that I recommend called Bit by Bit. I'll get the link and paste it in the chat. But so my suggestion would be, if you're interested in diving into this world, read this book or a book similar to it, just to get some sense of the kind of designs that you might start from before you start with the data source. That would be my suggestion.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, it's a great book. So we have to wrap up. Victoria, I still want to give you the chance to say something if you want before we close the panel.
No, I just want to thank you for this very exciting conversation. I enjoyed very much listening to my colleagues, to Sophia, Dennis, and Ridi. It's been a very provocative talk, and I wish for more encounters like this.
Yeah, same. I think it's been a great talk, and thank you all for taking the time to share your experience and knowledge with us.
Thank you, Diego, for organizing.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks to
Thank you.
Diego and the others for organizing this. Thank you.
And yeah.
Okay, so I
Thanks,
hope you
everyone.
have a nice day or evening.
Yes, and a productive
Okay.
rest of the conference.
Yeah.
Okay, take care. Bye.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye.